The silence in Elias's house was not empty. It was heavy, like a thick layer of dust that refused to be swept away. At 70, Elias moved through the hallways with a measured slowness, his shadow stretching long against the peeling wallpaper. The house was a museum of a life interrupted. In the master bedroom, his late wife Clara's perfume bottle sat on the vanity, its scent long evaporated into the stale air. Beside it lay a single, yellowed infant's sock, a relic of a son he hadn't seen in about 30 years. Elias was a man of routines. He made tea, he tended to his wilting garden, and he spent hours sitting by the front window. His mind, once a fractured glass of hallucinations and blackouts, had finally settled into a fragile clarity. The doctors called it stability, but to Elias, it felt like waking up in the middle of a movie after the projector had flickered out for 3 decades. He remembered Clara's face vividly, the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed. But the years following her death were a terrifying fog. He knew the facts, of course. He knew he had lost his mind after the birth. He knew he had taken his infant son to the supermarket one Tuesday afternoon and walked out alone. The police records stated he was found wandering the streets 3 days later, calling for a wife who was already buried, his mind having simply erased the existence of the child to survive the trauma. Every afternoon, Elias stared at the supermarket across the street. The bright neon signs and the constant stream of shoppers were a mocking reminder of the day his soul split in two. He lived in a state of perpetual repentance, praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in, asking for one thing: to know if the boy was alive. He didn't expect a miracle. He just wanted a sign. He wanted to know that the life he had accidentally discarded had found a way to bloom in the shadows. He didn't realize that his prayer was about to be answered in the most brutal way possible. At that moment, Elias heard a knock on the door. The knock was sharp, a rhythmic percussion that shattered the afternoon quiet. Elias didn't get visitors. He stood up, his joints protesting, and smoothed his cardigan. When he opened the door, the air seemed to leave his lungs. Standing there was a man in his early 30s. He had Clara's high cheekbones and her startling, deep-set hazel eyes. The resemblance was so striking that Elias felt a momentary lapse back into his illness, wondering if he was seeing a ghost. "Can I help you?" Elias whispered, his voice trembling. The younger man didn't smile. His face was a mask of cold, suppressed fury. "You don't recognize me, do you?" he asked. The voice was low, vibrating with an ancient resentment. "My name is Julian. Or at least, that's the name the state gave me after you left me next to the frozen peas like a bag of unwanted groceries." Elias staggered back, his hand clutching the doorframe. "Julian," he gasped. "My son. You're what?" Julian stepped into the entryway, his presence filling the small space. "You don't get to use that word. I spent my life wondering why I wasn't enough to keep. I grew up in foster homes and eventually with an adoptive mother who told me I was found. I did the work. I tracked the police reports. I found the man who simply forgot I existed. It wasn't like that," Elias pleaded, tears blurring his vision. "I was sick, Julian. After your mother died, the world went dark. My brain, it broke. I didn't mean to leave you. I loved you." "Love doesn't forget," Julian snapped. He looked around the house with disdain, his eyes landing on the infant sock on the vanity through the open bedroom door. "You've spent 30 years playing the martyr in this tomb, while I spent 30 years wondering if I was born broken. I didn't come here for a reunion, old man. I came to see if you were as pathetic as I imagined." Before Elias could find the words to explain the psychiatric wards or the years of therapy, Julian turned on his heel. He vanished into the evening light, leaving Elias collapsed on the floor of the hallway, the name of his son tasting like ash in his mouth. Elias did not sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Julian's face, a twisted reflection of the woman he had loved so dearly. The shock had passed, replaced by a desperate, frantic energy. He couldn't let it end there. He couldn't let his son believe that his abandonment was a choice. The next morning, Elias did something he hadn't done in years. He went to the local library and asked for help with the public records. He was 70 years old, and his hands shook as he navigated the computer, but the librarians, seeing the desperation in his eyes, helped him. He searched for the name Julian, cross-referencing the adoption agency mentioned in his old legal files. He discovered that Julian had been a successful architect, a man who built sturdy, unbreakable structures, perhaps a psychological response to the fractured beginning of his life. Elias found an address on the other side of the city, a modern apartment complex that looked nothing like the drafty, memory-shrouded house Elias occupied. He spent his small savings on taxi rides, traveling to the neighborhood where Julian lived. He sat in a small coffee shop across the street, watching the entrance of the building. He felt like a stalker, but the hunger in his heart was too great to ignore. He saw Julian twice. Once leaving for work with a briefcase, looking professional and distant, and once returning in the evening, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that Elias recognized all too well. The physical toll of the search was immense. Elias's legs ached, and his heart fluttered erratically in his chest. But the stability of his mind remained. He was no longer the broken man who wandered the streets. He was a father on a mission. He realized that Julian's anger was a shield, a protection against the pain of being discarded. And to break through that shield, Elias knew he needed more than just his own voice. He needed the truth, documented and undeniable. But first, he had to try one more time to speak to the man who carried his blood. Before Elias could confront Julian again, he realized he had to confront himself. He walked across the street to the supermarket, the very one where the tragedy had occurred. He hadn't stepped foot inside since he was 40 years old. The automatic doors hissed open, a sound like a sharp intake of breath. Inside, the fluorescent lights were blinding. The hum of the refrigeration units vibrated in his teeth. Suddenly, the present began to slip away. The smells of fresh produce and floor wax triggered a violent flashback. He was 40 again. He was holding a crying baby in a plastic carrier. His head felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. Clara was gone. The funeral had been a blur of black umbrellas and wet earth. In the memory, the baby's cries sounded like sirens. Elias remembered setting the carrier down on a bench near the entrance. He remembered thinking, I just need a minute of silence. Just 1 minute. He walked into the aisles to buy milk, but by the time he reached the back of the store, the blank spot had claimed him. He forgot why he was there. He forgot he had a son. He walked out the back exit, his mind convinced he was still a bachelor, headed home to a wife who was still alive. A store clerk touched his arm, snapping him back to the present. Sir, are you all right? You've been standing here for 10 minutes. Elias was trembling, drenched in a cold sweat. The realization hit him with renewed force. He hadn't been a monster. He had been a casualty. His brain had shut down to prevent him from taking his own life in the wake of Clara's death. He saw a young father pushing a cart with a toddler, and the sight nearly broke him. He had missed all of it. The first steps, the first words, the scraped knees. I'm fine, Elias whispered to the clerk, though he was far from it. He walked out of the store, his resolve hardened. He had seen the ghost of his past, and he understood the mechanics of his failure. Now, he had to make Julian see it, too. But the door to Julian's heart was locked tighter than any vault. The following week was a series of heartbreaks. Elias attempted to wait for Julian outside his apartment building, but Julian had grown wise to his presence. One afternoon, Julian stopped in front of Elias, his eyes flashing with ice. If I see you here again, I'm calling the police, Julian said, his voice devoid of emotion. You're harassing me. Whatever debt you think you're paying by stalking me, consider it canceled. I don't want your apologies. I don't want your history. Julian, please, Elias reached out. But the younger man stepped back as if touched by something diseased. Stay away from me, Julian warned. For the next 3 days, Elias kept showing up at Julian's house. Sometimes, he would watch the apartment from afar, but Julian had changed his routine. He wasn't taking the front entrance anymore. He was a ghost once again. Elias felt the old familiar shadows of depression creeping in at the edges of his vision. He knew that if he fell back into the darkness now, he would never come out. So he finally went back home, with a head full of thought and a heart full of grief. Back at his home, Elias sat at his kitchen table, looking at the old photographs of Clara. He looked at her sister, Martha, in the background of their wedding photo. Martha had moved away decades ago, unable to bear the sight of Elias's decline and the tragedy of the lost child. She had been angry, too, convinced that Elias's grief was no excuse for losing her nephew. At that moment, a spark of an idea flickered in Elias. Martha was the only other person who had been there. She was the one who had visited him in the psychiatric hospital when he didn't even know his own name. She had the medical records, the doctor's letters, and the perspective of someone who wasn't the villain. Elias packed a small bag. His bones ached and his breath was short, but he had a destination. He boarded a Greyhound bus headed for the neighboring state. He was going to find Martha. He was going to bring back the only witness to the death of his sanity. If Julian wouldn't listen to a neglectful father, perhaps he would listen to a grieving aunt. The journey to find Martha was grueling. Elias arrived in a small town 3 states away, his body feeling every mile of the road. When he finally found Martha's house, a charming cottage with a wraparound porch, he was nearly collapsing from exhaustion. Martha opened the door, and for a moment, time stood still. She was older, her hair a shock of white, but the stern set of her jaw was the same. "Elias?" she whispered. "My God, you look like a specter." "I found him, Martha," Elias said, his voice cracking. "I found Julian." The transformation in Martha was instantaneous. The sternness melted into a frantic curiosity. She pulled him inside and sat him down with a cup of tea. Elias told her everything. The knock at the door, Julian's hatred, and the blank spot that still haunted his memories. "He thinks I chose to leave him," Elias choked out. "He thinks I just didn't want him." Martha sighed, a long, weary sound. "I was angry at you for a long time, Elias. I thought you were weak. But then I saw you in that hospital. I saw the way you looked at the walls, screaming for Clara, having no idea you'd even had a son. You weren't a bad father. You were a dead man walking." She went to a closet and pulled out a dusty accordion file. Inside were the clinical records of Elias's 3-year stay in the state psychiatric facility. There were notes from nurses describing his catatonic states and his utter lack of orientation to reality. "We're going back," Martha said firmly. "He needs to see this. Not because it excuses the pain he went through, but because he deserves to know he wasn't unloved. He was just lost in a storm he didn't create." They traveled back together, a strange pair, the broken father and the fierce aunt. When they arrived back at Julian's apartment, Elias stayed in the car. He knew his presence would only trigger Julian's flight response. He watched as Martha walked up to the blue door and knocked. This was the final gambit. Julian opened the door, prepared to bark at the old man again, but he stopped short when he saw Martha. He didn't recognize her at first, but the family resemblance, the way she stood, the shape of her eyes, held him in place. "Julian," she said, her voice steady. "I'm Martha. I'm your mother's sister." The anger in Julian's face flickered into confusion. "My mother? She died 30 years ago," Martha said, stepping into the apartment before he could protest. "And your father died with her, in a way. I know what you think happened at that supermarket. I know what the world told you. But you only have half the story." She sat him down at his sleek, modern dining table and spread out the yellowed papers from the psychiatric home. She told him about the night he was born, how Clara had hemorrhaged, how Elias had held her hand as she slipped away. She described the month that followed, where Elias stopped eating and sleeping, his eyes becoming hollow pits of despair. "He didn't walk away from you because you were a burden, Julian," Martha said, her voice softening. "He walked away because his mind snapped. He was in a dissociative fugue. When he left you at that supermarket, he didn't even know he had a son anymore. His brain had deleted the last 9 months of his life to protect him from the agony of losing his wife." Julian looked at the papers. He saw the dates. He saw the signatures of the doctors. He saw the diagnosis, acute post-traumatic stress with dissociative amnesia. "He spent years in a locked ward," Martha continued. "When he finally came to his senses, the first thing he asked was where the baby was. But you were already gone, buried in the system. He spent the rest of his life looking for you in every face he passed." Julian's hand trembled as he touched a photo Martha had brought. A picture of Elias holding him in the hospital, looking down at the bundle with a look of such pure, terrified love that it was undeniable. The silence in Julian's apartment was deafening. Martha watched him, letting the weight of the truth sink in. For Julian, the world was shifting on its axis. The narrative he had built his entire identity around, the unwanted child, the discarded boy, was crumbling. "I thought," Julian started, his voice thick. "The woman who adopted me, she said she found me. She didn't know why. I assumed the worst. I assumed he just couldn't handle the responsibility and left me for someone else to deal with." "He never stopped loving your mother," Martha said. "And because you looked like her, you were the greatest joy and the greatest pain he had ever known." He wasn't equipped for it, Julian. He was a man, not a machine. Julian stood up and walked to the window. He looked down at the street and saw the car parked at the curb. He saw the silhouette of an old man sitting in the passenger seat, his head bowed. For the first time, Julian didn't see a villain. He saw a survivor. He saw a man who had lived through a mental apocalypse and was still standing, still trying to reach out across the ruins. "He came to see me," Julian whispered. "He tried to tell me, but I wouldn't listen. I was so horrible to him." "You were hurt," Martha said, standing up and placing a hand on his shoulder. "And he understands that. He's been waiting 30 years to tell you he's sorry. Not for choosing to leave you, but for being too broken to stay." Julian felt a sob build in his chest, a 30-year-old dam finally bursting. He had spent his life building walls of steel and glass, but they were useless against the simple, devastating truth of a father's tragedy. He turned to Martha, his eyes red and raw. "Is he still there? Is he still in the car?" "He's waiting," Martha said. "He'll wait forever if he has to." Julian didn't take the elevator. He ran down the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs. Every floor he descended felt like shedding a layer of the armor he had worn since childhood. He burst through the front doors of the apartment complex and marched out into the cool evening air. Elias was stepping out of the car, his movements stiff and uncertain. When he saw Julian running toward him, he froze, his face pale with fear. He expected another lecture, another rejection. But Julian stopped 5 feet away, his chest heaving. "I read the papers," Julian gasped. "I saw the doctor's notes." Elias couldn't speak. He just nodded, his eyes searching Julian's face for any sign of the hatred that had been there before. "I didn't know," Julian said, his voice breaking. "I thought I was a mistake. I thought I was something you threw away because I was a burden." "You were the only part of her I had left," Elias whispered, his voice as fragile as dry leaves. "I would have given my life to keep you, but I lost my mind instead. I'm so sorry, Julian. I'm so sorry I wasn't strong enough." Julian looked at his father, really looked at him. He saw the deep lines of grief etched into his skin, the way he carried himself like a man who had been apologizing to the air for decades. He realized that they had both been orphans. Elias had been orphaned by his mind, and Julian by the system. The distance between them, once a vast canyon of 30 years, suddenly felt small. Julian took the final steps forward. He didn't say anything. He simply reached out and pulled the old man into a hug. Elias let out a sound, a sob that had been trapped in his lungs since that Tuesday afternoon at the supermarket, and clung to his son as if he were the only solid thing in a shifting world. A week later, the two men met at the entrance of the supermarket across from Elias's house. It was Elias's suggestion. He knew that to truly move forward, they had to return to the place where time had stopped. The morning was bright and crisp. Julian arrived first, looking nervous but steady. When Elias walked across the street, he looked different, taller. Somehow, the weight of the blank spot no longer pressing down on his shoulders. They stood together at the automatic doors. The hiss of the entrance no longer sounded like a gasp of terror. It sounded like a welcome. "I remember the bench," Elias said, pointing to a wooden seat near the pharmacy counter. "That's where I put you. I thought you'd be safe for just a moment." Julian looked at the bench. He didn't feel the sting of abandonment anymore. He felt a strange sense of closure. "I was found by a woman named Sarah," Julian said quietly. "She was a good woman. She made sure I was fed. She made sure I had everything I wanted. You didn't leave me in a vacuum, Dad. You left me in a place where people help." Elias wiped his eyes. "I want to know everything. I want to know about Sarah. I want to know about the buildings you design. I want to know what you like for breakfast." "Dad," Julian said, "we have time," reaching out to take his father's arm. "We have all the time you have left." Together, the two men moved around the supermarket. They walked past the frozen aisles and the produce, not as ghosts of a tragedy, but as a father and a son. For the first time in 30 years, Elias didn't look at the exit. He looked at the man beside him. As they reached the back of the store, Julian picked up a carton of milk and placed it in the cart. "Let's go home," Julian said. And for the first time in his life, Elias knew exactly where home was. It wasn't the quiet house full of dust. It was wherever his son was standing. They walked out of the store together, the sun warming their backs, leaving the shadows of the past exactly where they belonged, behind them. If you find this story meaningful, kindly like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories updates. Also, what lesson did you learn from this story? We would like to know in the comments. Thank you for watching.